The chronicles do not give her a name. They do not agree on a kingdom. They do not even agree whether she lived at all. And yet, for centuries, her story was whispered across Europe like a curse. A queen, starving in the depths of famine, sits in the shadows of her banquet hall. The tables that once glittered with roasted meats and golden goblets now stand empty, bare but for scraps of stale bread and gnawed bones. Her crown sits crooked upon her head, her jewels pawned to pay mercenaries who long since deserted her. Around her, courtiers have fled. Her people are dying. Her kingdom has become a graveyard of frost and hunger, and in her arms she cradles a child, her own child. Once, she would have kissed the infant's head, whispered lullabies, prayed for his future, but in this moment the prayers are gone. Her eyes are sunken, her lips cracked, her stomach twisting in a torment beyond grief. Hunger has devoured her soul. She looks at the child not as a mother but as a beast, not with love, but with hunger. The chroniclers tell us she did the unthinkable. She killed her child. She cooked him. She ate him. It is a story so shocking, so vile, that even in an age when famine forced peasants to eat rats and dogs, it seemed almost too dark to record. And yet they did. The tale entered legend, passed from monastery to marketplace, from priest to peasant. The queen who ate her own children, a mother turned cannibal, a monarch turned monster. But here lies the question, was it true, or was it one of the countless weapons of slander forged in the forges of medieval politics? Was she a desperate woman driven mad by hunger? Or was she an invention of rumour, a symbol of corruption and sin, a tale told to terrify and control? The Middle Ages were thick with such stories. Chronicles were not newspapers, they were morality plays written in ink. They did not just report events, they explained them with the language of sin and punishment. A famine was not simply failed harvests, it was God's wrath. And a starving queen who consumed her own children was not merely a grotesque image, it was a warning about rulers who devoured their subjects through greed, neglect, or cruelty. And yet, there was always the possibility, lurking in the shadows, that the legend contained some truth. Because famine in the Middle Ages was not metaphor, it was reality. People starved. People ate grass, roots, bark, and even corpses. There are records, shocking, brutal, of parents driven to madness who killed and ate their children. If peasants could be driven to such horror, why not nobles? Why not queens? That tension, the impossible choice between truth and myth, is what gives the story its terrible power. On one hand, it is propaganda, a tale designed to demonize women and rulers. On the other, it is a glimpse into the darkest corners of human survival. And Catherine de' Medici, Elizabeth Báthory, Lucrezia Borgia, all of them, in later centuries would have their own legends of poison, blood, and lust. But the queen who ate her children stands apart. Her story is not of ambition or cruelty, it is of hunger. Hunger so deep it devoured not only her children, but her very humanity. The medieval world believed in monsters. They feared werewolves in the forests, witches in the villages, demons in the night. But the most terrifying monster was not outside the walls, it was inside them. A mother who turned on her child, a queen who became a cannibal. It inverted every ideal of Christendom, every sacred bond. The queen was supposed to feed her people, to nourish her realm like a mother nourishes her child. To say that a queen ate her own children was to say that monarchy itself was cursed, inverted, monstrous. Imagine the scene as medieval storytellers described it. The great hall of the palace dark and cold, the tapestries torn, the hearth empty of fire. The queen sits at the head of a long table, her crown slipping down her thin hair, her gown in tatters. Around her are empty platters, goblets overturned, gnawed bones scattered by rats. She raises the morsel of flesh to her lips, the eyes of her dead child staring lifeless from the platter. The courtiers who remain turn away in horror. Some flee, some faint. But the queen does not hesitate. She eats. The monks who recorded such tales did not always name her. Sometimes she was a French queen, sometimes a German empress, sometimes a nameless monarch of famine-stricken lands. The details shifted, the legend reshaped to fit each era. But the image remained, the queen who devoured her child. It was the kind of tale that needed no name because it carried a universal warning. It was a story meant to haunt. In the centuries that followed, the legend was recycled, reshaped, retold. She became a symbol of famine itself, a story whispered whenever hunger struck a kingdom. She became the archetype of monstrous motherhood, a figure invoked in sermons and fables. And in every retelling, the line between truth and legend blurred further. Was she real? Or was she a phantom conjured by fear? That is the banquet we begin with. Not of gold and glory, but of hunger and horror. A queen not remembered for her reign, but for her supposed feast of flesh. Her name may be lost, but her story endures, because it was never just about her. It was about what people feared most in the Middle Ages, not wolves in the woods, not demons in the dark, but the collapse of order, the inversion of love, the moment when even queens became monsters. The queen who ate her children, a myth, a memory, a nightmare, and perhaps in some terrible way, a truth. In the medieval world, truth was never simply what happened. Truth was what was written, what was preached, what was whispered. The chroniclers who ink the pages of history were not journalists. They were monks, clerics, servants of kings and bishops. Their pens were not weapons of fact, but of morality, propaganda and survival. They did not just record the world as it was, they shaped it into a story their patrons wanted told, and in those stories rumour and reality intertwined until they were indistinguishable. The famine that emptied granaries was recorded as the wrath of God. The plague that swept through villages became punishment for sin. A queen who failed to bear heirs became not unlucky, but cursed. And if whispers said that a starving monarch had eaten her own child, then the whispers became history. Whispers were power. They travelled faster than any army, and they left more lasting wounds than any sword. In the narrow alleys of Paris, in the smoky taverns of London, in the marketplaces of Cologne, people lived on rumour. Who had betrayed the king? Which noble had sold his soul to the devil? Which queen had poisoned her rivals, or worse, devoured her children? It did not matter if the whispers were true. What mattered was that they felt true. And in a world racked by famine, where mothers truly did abandon infants in ditches, where hunger gnawed so fiercely that corpses were stolen from gallows and graves for meat, the tale of a queen who ate her child resonated with terrifying plausibility. The medieval mind thrived on allegory. Every story was a symbol, every legend a mirror of morality. To accuse a queen of cannibalism was not only to damn her personally, but to damn monarchy itself. The queen, after all, was supposed to be the mother of the realm, feeding her people as she fed her children. If famine struck, if bellies emptied, if people starved, it was the queen's failure. To say she ate her own children was to say she had turned that sacred bond upside down. Instead of feeding her people, she fed upon them. Instead of nourishing, she devoured. And so, whispers of cannibal queens took root. Chroniclers scribbled them down with relish, perhaps with horror, perhaps with glee. Priests used them in sermons, warning congregations that sin led to inversion, to the unnatural. "Behold," they said, "what comes of greed and pride. Even queens will eat their babes when God's wrath strikes." For peasants, who had seen famine firsthand, the lesson was unforgettable. The whispers were not just slander, they were parables carved from starvation. But whispers were also political weapons. If a queen was unpopular, if she failed to charm her court, if she was foreign-born, the rumours multiplied like plague rats. Catherine de' Medici was Italian, and so the French whispered that she poisoned rivals. Isabella of France was a foreign bride, and so the English named her the she-wolf. Lucretia Borgia was the Pope's daughter, and so her enemies whispered incest and murder. Foreign queens were always easy prey. They brought strange tongues, strange customs, strange advisers. They were already outsiders, and outsiders became monsters with little effort. The Cannibal Queen, unnamed in most chronicles, may well have been such a figure. A foreign bride who failed to feed her people. During famine, a woman already despised for her accent or her lineage, who became the scapegoat for hunger. In truth, she may never have lifted a knife against her child. But the whispers needed little truth to thrive. In the candlelit monasteries, monks copied tales that blurred fact and slander. In every retelling, the queen grew darker, the details more lurid. One version said she roasted the infant. Another said she boiled him into stew. Another claimed she ate him raw, like a beast. The details shifted, but the whispers always agreed. She was no longer a woman, no longer a mother, no longer a queen. She was a monster. The power of rumour in the Middle Ages cannot be overstated. It toppled nobles, ignited riots, and shaped reputations for centuries. The Templars were destroyed not by armies, but by whispers of heresy and sodomy. Witches were burned not for deeds proven, but for whispers of pacts with Satan. A woman accused of sleeping with her brother, of poisoning her rivals, of eating her child, such a woman was damned long before truth could be sought. Whispers became judgment, and judgment became history. For women in power, the whispers were often the cruelest. Medieval Europe held motherhood as sacred. A good queen was fertile, gentle, nourishing, pious. She bore heirs, tended to charity, prayed before altars. A bad queen, especially one who dared wield influence, was painted as the opposite. Childless queens were barren witches. Powerful queens were seductresses or poisoners. And the most monstrous queen of all was the cannibal mother, who not only failed to nourish, but inverted motherhood into horror. These whispers stuck because they fit neatly into cultural fears. They were not only slanders, they were warnings. They were used to control women, to frighten subjects, to frame famine as divine punishment. They were repeated until they became legend, legend until they became fact. And once a story is written in ink, once it is carved into parchment, it becomes immortal. The queen who ate her children may never have lived, but in whispers she became eternal. Picture the scene in a medieval marketplace. A starving peasant sells his last turnip. A priest stands upon a crate, warning the crowd of famine and sin. "Have you not heard," he says, "of the wicked queen who ate her children in hunger? Repent, lest the same fate befall us all." The crowd gasps, crosses themselves, whispers the story to neighbours. By nightfall, the tale spreads from hearth to hearth, from village to village. No one asks if it is true. Truth matters less than fear. And this is how the queen who ate her children was born, not from fact, but from whispers in the dark. Whispers that echoed louder than armies, whispers that could outlive dynasties, whispers that turned a nameless woman into an immortal monster. History is not kind to women who wield power. It has a way of reshaping them, bending their lives into legends of sin and monstrosity. Behind the story of the queen who ate her children, there may not be one woman, but many. Queens and empresses across centuries whose reputations were darkened by famine, slander, and fear. Some were foreign brides, despised before they even set foot in their kingdoms. Others were widows, regents, or rulers in their own right, whose strength threatened men who preferred docile consorts. Into this cauldron of suspicion and hunger, the legend of the Cannibal Queen was born. When we look for candidates, we find no single name repeated consistently. Chroniclers wrote vaguely, a certain queen in time of famine, or a lady of high estate who, maddened by hunger, consumed her babe. Yet, if we peel back the layers, we can glimpse shadows of real women whose lives may have inspired such stories. One candidate lies in the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when Europe was struck by years of relentless rain, crop failure, and starvation. In France, the court of Queen Jeanne of Burgundy, consort of King Philip V, was beset by public hatred. Jeanne herself was imprisoned for adultery during the infamous Tour de Nail scandal, accused of betraying her husband with knights. Though later released and restored, her reputation never recovered. Chroniclers delighted in portraying her as sinful, corrupt, unmotherly. During the famine, when peasants died in droves, whispers grew darker. Was this not punishment for a sinful queen? And in the allegorical mind of the time, what better symbol than the rumour that she devoured her own child? Another shadow falls over Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Known later as the she-wolf of France, Isabella was accused of conspiring with her lover to depose and murder her husband. Chroniclers painted her as vicious, unfeminine, monstrous. One chronicle even suggested she had unnatural desires toward her own son, the future Edward III. In a world already prepared to believe her capable of incest and betrayal, the leap to cannibalism was not far. a mother turned predator. It was the ultimate inversion of medieval ideals of queenship. There is also Empress Irene of Byzantium, who ruled centuries earlier but lingered in Western imagination. She was accused of blinding her own son to keep power. To the medieval mind, this act alone was unholy, a violation of maternal duty. If a mother could destroy her child's sight, why not his flesh? Irene's story may have echoed faintly into the Cannibal Queen legend, reshaped to fit Western fears of famine. But perhaps the most compelling candidates are nameless foreign brides. In the chronicles of famine years, again and again, faceless queens are accused of greed, of hoarding food, of feasting while peasants starved. These accusations were often thinly veiled xenophobia. A French queen with a Spanish accent, an English queen with Italian advisors, a German empress who brought strange customs, all were easy targets. When famine came, the people did not blame the weather or failed harvests. They blamed the foreign woman in the palace. From there it was only a short step to tales of her feasting on her own children. The truth is, the queen who ate her children may not have existed as a single person at all. She may be a composite, a legend woven from fragments of many women's lives. The adulterous queen, the she-wolf queen, the foreign queen, the barren queen. All their sins, real or imagined, were gathered into one monstrous archetype. And in famine years that archetype was brought to life in rumour, a queen who devoured her own child. To understand how such slanders took root, we must also consider how medieval chroniclers used women's bodies as symbols. Queens were not seen as individuals, but as allegories for the state. A fertile queen meant a fertile land. A barren queen meant famine. A wicked queen meant divine punishment. If a queen ate her child, it symbolized a realm that devoured its own people. Chroniclers, steeped in allegory, may never have meant the tale literally. But peasants, hearing it in taverns and sermons, took it as truth. Thus a metaphor became a monster. And yet, behind the allegory, real suffering lurked. Parents in famine years truly did abandon or even consume their children. Chroniclers recorded such horrors with grim fascination. In 1317, one monk wrote of peasants in France who dug up corpses for food. In Germany, a tale spread of a starving mother who killed her infant to survive. These stories mingled with court gossip until the cannibal mother became a queen. The queen in the shadows, then, is not one woman but a gallery of them. Jeanne of Burgundy, Isabella of France, Irene of Byzantium, all accused of monstrosities they may never have committed. And countless nameless queens, hated for their foreign tongues, despised in famine years, transformed into cannibals by the whispering mouths of their people. But that is the nature of dark history. It is not the literal truth that survives. It is the legend, the slander, the story that shocks so deeply it refuses to die. The queen who ate her children may never have lived, yet she is more immortal than queens who truly did. She lives in whispers, in chronicles, in the fear that even the most sacred bonds, mother to child, queen to subject, can be inverted into horror. The banquet of horror from chapter 1 was never meant to describe a meal in reality. It was meant to describe a kingdom in collapse. But the chroniclers gave it a face, a queen's face, a shadowed face, a face that stares at us still across centuries as the legend endures. The medieval world was no stranger to death. Plague, war, childbirth and battle claimed lives with brutal frequency. But famine was different. Famine was not swift like the sword or sudden like the fever. Famine was slow. It crept into every household, gnawed at every stomach, hollowed out faces, and left entire kingdoms staggering like skeletons. It was famine, more than any single event that bred the darkest legends. The tale of the queen who ate her children is rooted in this reality. In the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, one of the most catastrophic episodes in European history. For 2 years, relentless rains fell across the continent. Crops rotted in the fields, wheat, rye and barley drowned in mud. Bread, the staple of life, became scarce, then vanished. Cattle, too, died by the thousands, their hooves sinking in the flooded ground. Even the salt used to preserve meat washed away in the storms. Without salt, without grain, without cattle, Europe starved. Prices soared. A loaf of bread cost 6 times its normal price. Families sold their homes, their tools, even their children for food. In towns and villages, beggars crowded the streets, their hands outstretched, their eyes empty. In the countryside, mothers abandoned infants at monastery gates, unable to feed them. Entire families wandered roadsides, searching for scraps, their bodies covered in sores from malnutrition. Chroniclers recorded the horror with grim fascination. They wrote of peasants eating dogs, cats, even rats. They wrote of people stripping bark from trees, grinding it into flour to make bread that poisoned more than it nourished. They wrote of corpses left unburied, not from neglect but because they were eaten. And many, one monk wrote, were driven to eat the flesh of the dead. Cannibalism in the famine years was not just a rumour, it was a reality. In the absence of food, hunger dissolved taboos. Parents smothered infants and roasted them over fires. Children scavenged the bodies of their mothers. Soldiers, trapped in fortresses without supplies, boiled the flesh of the fallen. The famine reduced men and women alike to beasts. It was in this age of hunger that the story of the Cannibal Queen took shape. The peasants, starving, looked up at the palace on the hill. They saw smoke rise from chimneys while their own hearths went cold. They imagined feasts behind castle walls while they gnawed bones and weeds. In truth, famine struck rich and poor alike, but perception mattered more than fact. If peasants starved, they believed their rulers feasted. If their children died, they believed their queens devoured theirs. The Great Famine was not the only one. Medieval Europe was a fragile ecosystem, at the mercy of weather and war. Failed harvests came again and again. In 1258, famine swept England so severely that 30,000 died in London alone. In 1438, floods destroyed crops in Germany, sparking riots. In 1481, famine hit France so brutally that people begged for death. Each famine brought with it new whispers of horror, new tales of cannibalism, new accusations against rulers. And famine was not just hunger. It brought plague in its wake. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them ripe for disease. Dysentery spread through contaminated water. Pneumonia struck the weakened. In many villages, half the population perished. Survivors, gaunt and skeletal, carried stories of horror to the next generation. The age of hunger also reshaped the moral imagination. Chroniclers did not record famine merely as weather. They saw it as divine punishment. Failed harvests meant failed rulers. A weak king or a sinful queen invited God's wrath on the land. And so, famine was always tied to politics. If crops failed, it must be because the monarch was corrupt, because the queen was sinful. Hunger itself became proof of wickedness in the palace. The queen was the easiest target. She was supposed to embody motherhood, to feed and nurture. When hunger devoured the land, she became the inversion of that role. She was no longer the mother of the realm, but the devourer of her own children. Cannibal Queen stories were born not only of famine, but of misogyny, of the cultural need to blame women for catastrophe. The chroniclers gave these horrors shape. They did not simply describe hunger. They told stories of desperation that blurred into allegory. A mother who ate her child became a symbol of famine itself. A queen who did so became a symbol of corrupted monarchy. And in a time when few could read, these stories spread in whispers, sermons and theatre. We must remember that medieval Europe was obsessed with inversion, the turning upside down of the natural order. Witches inverted baptism with satanic rites. Heretics inverted the cross. Cannibalism inverted the most sacred bond of all, the love between mother and child. To say that famine produced a cannibal queen was to say that the world itself had turned upside down, that God's creation had been perverted into horror. The age of hunger also gave birth to darker rituals, stories of witches devouring children, of demons demanding infant sacrifices, of nobles feasting on human flesh. These were all metaphors drawn from the lived experience of famine. When you have seen corpses eaten, when you have seen parents kill children, it is not difficult to believe that a queen too might be guilty. The queen who ate her children, then, is not only a story about one woman. It is the story of famine itself, of hunger so deep it became myth. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 left wounds that lasted generations. It shaped chronicles, sermons, and memory. And into that wound, the legend of the Cannibal Queen was etched, carried forward by whispers until it became immortal. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often think of knights and castles, tournaments and banners. But beneath that glittering surface was a continent on the brink of starvation, again and again. The peasants who starved remembered their suffering not in statistics but in stories. And the most shocking of those stories was of a queen who betrayed her sacred duty, who ate her children in the darkness of her hall. It was a legend born of rain, mud, empty fields and hollow bellies. An allegory written in hunger, a horror born in the age of hunger. The story of the queen who ate her children did not appear out of thin air. It was not born in a single night of horror, nor in the act of one desperate woman. It was born in the fertile soil of famine, slander and fear, cultivated by the pens of chroniclers who knew that nothing horrified and nothing instructed, so deeply as the image of a mother devouring her own child. The myth did not spread because it was factual. It spread because it was useful. Medieval chronicles were never neutral. They were moral sermons disguised as history, written by monks, clerics, and scholars who believed their role was not only to record but to warn, to guide, to shape the understanding of their readers. When harvest failed, they did not write of weather cycles or agricultural mismanagement. They wrote of divine punishment, of sins festering at court, of rulers who had failed their sacred duty. And to make that failure vivid, they told stories. A tale of a queen who feasted on her children was the most extreme metaphor imaginable. The queen was, in theory, the mother of her people. If famine devoured the land, she was supposed to protect them. If hunger hollowed bellies, she was supposed to feed them. To say that she ate her own children was to say that monarchy itself had inverted, that the sacred trust between ruler and subject had collapsed into horror. It was less a report than a sermon. Behold what happens when rulers sin. Even queens turn against their children. Even mothers become monsters. It is no coincidence that these tales proliferated during times of famine and civil unrest. Chroniclers were always looking for villains, and queens made easy ones. Foreign brides were already unpopular, their accents and customs suspicious. Childless queens were whispered to be cursed. Strong queens, who dared to influence policy, were seen as unfeminine, domineering, dangerous. A rumour of cannibalism took root easily in such soil. Consider how the story would have spread. A famine grips a region. A foreign-born queen is already disliked. Grain is hoarded in castles while peasants starve. A child dies in a village, eaten by desperate parents. The story leaps to the court. If peasants must eat their children, the whispers grow, perhaps the queen does as well. The tale spreads, reshaped, retold, embroidered. Soon, the story is no longer about peasants but about the queen herself. Chroniclers, hearing the whispers, record them as allegory. In the next generation, the allegory is retold as fact. And thus a myth is born. The mechanism is clear when we compare the Cannibal Queen to other infamous female legends. Elizabeth Báthory was accused of bathing in the blood of virgins, a grotesque exaggeration of real cruelty, turned into a tale so shocking it eclipsed all truth. Catherine de' Medici was said to possess a cabinet of poisons and to have orchestrated massacres with perfumed gloves. Lucrezia Borgia was accused of incest, poison, and every conceivable sin of lust. In each case, the reality of powerful women was reframed into monstrous myth. The Cannibal Queen fits this same pattern, only darker, more primal. And there is another reason the myth had power. Cannibalism inverted Christianity's holiest ritual. The Eucharist was the symbolic act of consuming the body and blood of Christ. To accuse a queen of eating her children was to portray her as an antichrist figure, a blasphemous inversion of the sacred feast. She was not feeding her people with the bread of life. She was feeding herself with the flesh of innocence. This made the story not just scandalous but sacrilegious, a warning of sin and damnation wrapped in maternal horror. The birth of the myth also reveals the gendered cruelty of medieval imagination. Kings were accused of tyranny, of cruelty, of debauchery. But queens were accused of unnatural sins, witchcraft, incest, cannibalism. For a king, failing to protect his people meant cowardice. For a queen, failing meant monstrosity. To eat one's own children was the ultimate betrayal of womanhood, and therefore the ultimate way to demonize a queen. We see this clearly in sermons delivered during famines. Priests, desperate to explain why God punished the land, pointed fingers at women. As Eve brought sin into the world, they warned, so too wicked queens bring hunger upon their people. They told stories of cannibal mothers not only to horrify, but to justify suffering. Hunger, they explained, was the natural outcome of sin, and the queen was the embodiment of sin itself. The myth also functioned as political propaganda. Noble factions who wanted to discredit a queen could use such tales to erode her legitimacy. If a queen was accused of poisoning rivals, the court might whisper. But if she was accused of eating her children, the accusation spread like wildfire, impossible to contain. It crossed from the elite into the common imagination, from palace intrigue into tavern gossip. It did not matter whether the queen in question had ever raised a knife. The image alone destroyed her reputation forever. The Cannibal Queen myth likely began as a metaphorical device in chronicles, an allegory of rulers devouring their subjects through greed and misrule. But medieval minds did not always separate metaphor from fact. Over time, allegory hardened into belief. By the 15th century, stories of noble women eating children were being told as though they were eyewitness accounts. Monks copied them into manuscripts. Balladeers sang them. Priests thundered them from pulpits. And once written, such tales gained immortality. Unlike flesh, which rotted, ink endured. The queen who ate her children could never die, because her legend lived in every whispered retelling, in every sermon of famine, in every chronicle of sin. Thus the myth was born, not from fact, but from fear, not from an act, but from allegory. A nameless queen, a foreign bride, a failed mother, her imagery shaped into the most shocking tale of all, that hunger drove her not only to betray her people, but to devour her own child. It was not true. It did not need to be true. In the medieval world, the power of a story was not measured in facts, but in fear. And no story terrified more than this one. In the world of the Middle Ages, queens were never just women. They were symbols, projections of fear and desire, scapegoats for famine, lust, and sin. And when society needed to explain disaster, it turned to the figure of the queen not as mother, not as consort, but as monster. Out of this cultural imagination emerged what historians now call the feminine monstrous, the tendency to cast women in positions of power as witches, poisoners, seductresses, and in the darkest cases, cannibals. Medieval Europe's view of women was shaped by scripture, sermons, and inherited myth. At its core was the story of Eve, the woman who brought sin into the world by listening to the serpent. Every famine, every plague, every act of rebellion could be traced, in the eyes of preachers, back to the weakness of women. To many men of the period, women were naturally more susceptible to sin, more likely to consort with the devil, more prone to betrayal. Through woman, wrote one theologian, all evil enters. With such a foundation, queens were always walking a knife's edge. When a queen fulfilled her role, obedient wife, fertile mother, pious consort, she was praised. But if she stepped beyond it, if she sought power, challenged nobles, or simply failed to produce heirs, she was transformed in the collective imagination. She became unfeminine, unnatural, and what was unnatural was monstrous. Accusations followed predictable patterns. A powerful queen was rarely accused of simple cruelty. Instead, she was accused of unnatural sins, incest, witchcraft, sorcery, cannibalism. These were not merely crimes, they were violations of the very order of the world. They inverted what a woman was supposed to be. A mother who nurtured became a mother who devoured. A wife who supported became a seductress who betrayed. A queen who should symbolize life became a queen who embodied death. The image of the Cannibal Queen is perhaps the purest example of this inversion. Motherhood was the most sacred expectation of queenship. A queen was not only to bear heirs, but to embody nourishment and fertility for the kingdom. Her body symbolized abundance. Her womb was the promise of the future. To accuse her of eating her own children was to twist this image into its most grotesque opposite. It was the annihilation of the maternal ideal, the transformation of the nurturing mother into a devouring witch. Other women suffered similar fates in rumour. Isabella of France, who rebelled against her husband Edward II, was accused not only of betrayal, but of being a she-wolf. Chroniclers insisted she had taken her lover into her bed while her husband languished, and some even hinted at inappropriate closeness with her son. Her sin was not simply political. It was sexual, monstrous, unnatural. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful queens of her age, was rumoured to have shared her bed with her uncle, and later with her son. Chroniclers could not accept that she wielded political power through diplomacy and rebellion. Instead, they imagined her as an incestuous schemer. Empress Irene of Byzantium, who blinded her son to keep power, was described as more beast than mother. The act of mutilating her child was framed not as political strategy, but as evidence that she was an inhuman mother figure. Even when queens were not accused of literal cannibalism, the language surrounding them often evoked it. Chroniclers described them as devouring their people through greed, or as consuming kingdoms through lust. The imagery was always bodily, visceral, tied to the inversion of femininity. The feminine monstrous was not limited to queens. Ordinary women accused of witchcraft were imagined as killers of children, as women who feasted on infants at the Sabbath. Demons, witches, and cannibal queens blurred together in the medieval imagination. The monstrous woman was always tied to the body: blood, milk, flesh, womb. The same parts of women that were supposed to nurture were reframed as dangerous, deadly, insatiable. There was also an element of fascination in these tales. Men who wrote them both feared and desired the monstrous queen. She was dangerous, yes, but also compelling. Her defiance of natural order made her alluring. Chronicles describe such women with a strange relish, lingering on the grotesque details of their supposed crimes. In portraying queens as monstrous, chroniclers could both condemn and obsess over them. The Cannibal Queen, then, is the ultimate feminine monstrous figure. She embodies all the fears men projected onto women: unfaithful, unnatural, unfeminine. She is mother turned predator, queen turned witch, woman turned beast. Her crime is not only horrific in itself, it is horrific because it destroys the ideal of motherhood, the very core of medieval society's vision of womanhood. And so, when famine struck, when hunger hollowed the land, when children truly did die in their mother's arms, the perfect story was ready. The queen herself had devoured them. She was no longer human, no longer mother, no longer queen. She was a monster. This is how misogyny shaped legend. It was not enough for a queen to fail. She had to fail in the most unnatural way possible, and nothing, in the medieval imagination, was more unnatural than a mother eating her child. The feminine monstrous survives in memory not because it was true, but because it struck so deeply at cultural fears. Queens accused of incest, sorcery, and cannibalism became immortal not in glory, but in infamy. Their names, or the shadows of their names, endure in whispers centuries later. And the queen who ate her children, whether she lived or not, became the darkest shadow of them all. Cannibalism is one of humanity's greatest taboos. To eat flesh is to erase the line between human and beast, to destroy the bonds of kinship and community. Yet in the Middle Ages, cannibalism was not just whispered in famine years. It was embedded into the very imagination of culture, religion, and folklore. The queen who ate her children was not an isolated nightmare. She was part of a larger tapestry, a dark mirror of medieval fears where the act of eating human flesh symbolized everything society dreaded about collapse, sin, and chaos. To understand why the story of the Cannibal Queen endured, we must first look at how medieval Europe understood cannibalism itself. On one hand, it was a very real, if desperate, act. Famine after famine brought reports of parents killing children, of starving villagers boiling corpses, of besieged cities reduced to unthinkable measures. Chroniclers recorded these moments with both disgust and fascination. On the other hand, cannibalism became metaphor, a way of describing tyranny, greed, or heresy. Kings who taxed too heavily were said to devour their people. Heretics who lured innocents astray were accused of feasting on children. Witches were imagined as gathering in Sabbaths to roast infants on spits. Cannibalism was not only horror, it was the ultimate symbol of inversion. In famine chronicles, cannibalism was described as an inevitable endpoint of hunger. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, one monk wrote, "And mothers in despair consumed the very fruit of their womb." This may have been exaggeration, but it reflected a truth medieval people could imagine all too vividly. When you had seen neighbours eat dogs, cats, even corpses pulled from gallows, the line between rumour and reality blurred. Tales of cannibal mothers were not dismissed as impossible. They were dreaded as plausible. This plausibility is what made the figure of the Cannibal Queen so powerful. She was not just a monster invented by slander. She was rooted in a cultural context where cannibalism was both real and symbolic. When peasants heard she had eaten her children, they shuddered because they knew hunger could drive anyone to madness. And when nobles heard it, they nodded grimly, reading it as allegory, a corrupt monarch consuming the lifeblood of her kingdom. Religion gave the motif even darker weight. Christianity was built around the idea of the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ consumed in bread and wine. Though symbolic, this ritual blurred dangerously close to the language of cannibalism. For believers, it was sacred, an act of communion. For critics and heretics, it was horrifying. Pagans accused Christians of being cannibals, feasting on flesh in secret. Later, Christians themselves turned the accusation outward, describing Jews, heretics, and witches as baby eaters and blood drinkers. Cannibalism in this way became the universal language of evil, and women bore the brunt of it. Witches especially were imagined as devourers of children. Sermons described them boiling infants into potions, grinding bones into powders, roasting babies on spits. The witch was, in essence, the cannibal mother. The inversion of the nurturing figure transformed into predator. The queen who ate her children was simply this archetype writ large, magnified onto the stage of royalty. She was a witch in a crown, a cannibal in velvet. The fear of cannibal women was deeply tied to anxieties about the female body. Milk and blood were symbols of nourishment and life. But in dark imagination, they became signs of corruption. The same breasts that fed could be imagined as draining life. The same womb that birthed could be imagined as consuming flesh. Cannibalism was not only about eating, it was about inversion of the maternal, about the terror of mothers-turned-destroyers. But cannibalism was not always slander. It was also a tool of storytelling. Medieval romances and epics sometimes featured cannibalistic villains, giants who feasted on men, Saracens who roasted Christians, pagans who devoured the innocent. These tales functioned as propaganda, painting outsiders as savages. The cultural logic was clear. We are civilized. They are cannibals. To accuse a queen of cannibalism was to cast her as an outsider within, a traitor wearing a crown. Cannibalism even appeared in folklore. In tales whispered to children, ogres lurked in forests waiting to devour the young. Hansel and Gretel, centuries later, would crystallize this archetype, a witch fattening children to eat them. Medieval Europe already knew that story in countless variations, and so, when whispers spread of a queen eating her child, it fits seamlessly into a folklore tradition already filled with devouring mothers, child snatchers, and witches. The fear was not only physical, but moral. Cannibalism represented the collapse of order. It meant that hunger had dissolved every bond of loyalty, every bond of kinship, every command of God. To eat flesh was to declare that the world had turned upside down, and in the medieval obsession with inversion, nothing was more terrifying than a mother inverting her role, consuming her child instead of protecting him. This is why the queen who ate her children was more than just slander. She was a cultural inevitability. Medieval minds had already primed themselves with stories of witches, of famine cannibals, of tyrants who devoured their people. All it took was one famine, one foreign queen, one chronicler with a sharp pen, and the archetype sprang to life. We can even see how the image carried political bite. A queen accused of cannibalism symbolized a monarchy that no longer nourished its people. She became a walking allegory. Her hunger mirrored the hunger of the land. Her sin explained the suffering of her subjects. In this way, the myth justified rebellion, justified hatred, justified the belief that famine was not only natural but divine punishment for a wicked ruler. And so, cannibalism in medieval culture was never just about eating. It was about fear, inversion, and power. It was the language of ultimate sin, the metaphor for tyranny, the curse of famine made flesh. The queen who ate her children became the pinnacle of this cultural imagination. She was both real and unreal, rooted in the horrors of famine yet shaped by misogyny and propaganda. She was the witch, the ogre, the tyrant, the failed mother, all fused into one monstrous figure. And as the myth spread, it gained new layers. Some said she roasted her child. Others said she stewed him. Others still said she ate him raw, like a beast. The details mattered less than the horror. What mattered was the inversion, that motherhood itself had turned cannibal, that the sacred bond of family had become the most profane act of all. This is why the story endured. Cannibalism in medieval culture was never only literal, it was symbolic, allegorical, terrifying. It was used to define outsiders, to demonize women, to punish rulers, to warn against sin. The queen who ate her children was not an anomaly. She was the natural culmination of centuries of cannibal myths. And so, in every famine, in every whisper of hunger, her story was reborn. Because the fear she embodied was not confined to one queen, one kingdom, or one famine. It was the universal fear of collapse, of mothers turned to monsters, of hunger devouring civilization itself. In the Middle Ages there was no figure more feared, more reviled, more despised than the witch. She was imagined as the woman who betrayed the natural order, who consorted with demons, who inverted everything that was sacred. And when famine or plague struck, it was often the witch who bore the blame. Crops had failed, the witch had cursed the fields, children died in the night, the witch had sucked their blood, men became impotent, cattle barren, the witch had cast her spells. She was the scapegoat for everything inexplicable, everything terrifying. So when whispers spread of a queen who had eaten her own child, it was almost inevitable that she was not just painted as monstrous, but as witch-like. In the medieval imagination, a queen who devoured her offspring was not merely desperate, she was demonic. She was Lilith reborn, the dark mother of Jewish myth who refused to submit to Adam, fled Eden, and in rage became a child killer. Lilith stalked the night, strangling infants and devouring their flesh. To accuse a queen of eating her children was in effect to call her a Lilith on the throne. Queens and witches shared more than a cultural connection. They shared the fear of female power. Witches were women who acted outside the authority of church and husband. Queens who ruled in times of famine or as regents were likewise women acting outside the natural bounds of society. The line between a queen wielding power and a witch wielding magic was often thin. Chroniclers blurred it easily, and for commoners, it hardly mattered whether the queen was truly guilty. To see famine, to see hunger, to see death in the streets was proof enough that the queen must have sinned, that she must be unnatural, that she must be a witch. The merging of queen and witch was reinforced in sermons. Priests warning against famine spoke of rulers who turned against God. A queen who failed to nourish her people was compared to Jezebel, the Old Testament queen accused of idolatry and corruption. Jezebel became a kind of prototype for the cannibal queen. Painted with cosmetics, whispering in shadows, leading men astray, devouring not only her family but her nation. In art and folklore, witches were often depicted around cauldrons, boiling flesh, stewing infants, mixing blood with herbs. These images bled into the tales of queens. The cannibal queen was sometimes described as not merely eating her child, but cooking him in a great pot, as if she were preparing a witch's brew. This was no accident. To medieval minds, cannibalism and witchcraft were linked. Both were acts of inversion. Both were assaults on God's creation. Both were the destruction of innocence. Consider also the Sabbath of the witches, as described in countless trial records. Witches were accused of gathering at night to kiss the devil, to trample the cross, and to feast on unbaptized infants. In many accounts, they roasted the babies, smeared themselves with the fat, and drank their blood. The details are lurid, terrifying, and entirely consistent with the imagery of the cannibal queen. The queen who ate her children was imagined as hosting her own unholy Sabbath, feasting not in secret groves but in her palace halls. Her banquet became a demonic inversion of a royal feast. Even political enemies exploited this witch-like imagery. When Catherine de' Medici was accused of poisoning rivals and orchestrating massacres, she was described as using astrology, black magic, and demonic rituals. When Isabella of France was accused of betrayal, she was painted not only as adulteress, but as a she-wolf, half human, half beast. The cannibal queen was simply the extreme version of this trend. If witches feasted on infants in forests, queens feasted on their children in palaces. The connection to Lilith was especially powerful. Lilith was the nightmare of the Middle Ages. a woman who refused submission, who killed infants, who seduced men in their sleep. She was invoked in charms to protect children, whispered in lullabies, feared in dreams. The queen who ate her child embodied Lilith's defiance on a throne. She was the ruler who refused her proper role, the mother who destroyed instead of nourished. Even the church reinforced the connection. Witch trials often described women accused of killing and eating their children. Sometimes these confessions were tortured out of them, other times invented entirely, but they provided proof to the public that cannibal mothers existed. If peasants could believe in witch mothers who devoured infants in forests, how difficult was it to believe in a queen who did the same in her castle? The Cannibal Queen, then, was not simply a tale of famine. She was part of a larger archetype, a cultural fear that stretched across centuries and cultures. She was the monstrous mother, the witch mother, the inversion of the Virgin Mary. Where Mary nourished Christ and symbolically the world, the Cannibal Queen nourished only herself. She was the anti-Mary, the blasphemous mother who betrayed every sacred bond. This imagery was so powerful because it was not just political, it was spiritual. To accuse a queen of eating her child was to cast her outside of humanity, outside of salvation. She was no longer a ruler to be obeyed. She was a witch to be feared, a demon to be destroyed. In this way, the myth functioned as a kind of political exorcism. To vilify a queen as witch and cannibal was to strip her of legitimacy, to justify rebellion, to prepare the people to reject her. She was not simply a bad queen, she was an enemy of God. The queen who ate her children thus became the ultimate merging of queen and witch. She was political slander turned spiritual nightmare, famine metaphor turned demonic archetype. She was Lilith on the throne, Jezebel in velvet, a witch crowned in gold. And like all witches, her story was told and retold not because it was true, but because it was useful. Useful to explain famine, useful to justify rebellion, useful to remind people of the dangers of women who stepped outside their roles. In the end, the queen as witch was not just about one woman. It was about every woman in power who terrified the men around her. It was about the cultural need to believe that hunger, death, and chaos must come from a woman's sin. And it was about the way fear turns queens into monsters, mothers into witches, rulers into demons. The queen who ate her children was the darkest incarnation of this fear. Not merely a bad queen, not merely a failed mother, but a witch upon the throne, feasting on the very flesh she was meant to protect. Hunger is not only a physical torment, it is a political weapon. In the Middle Ages, famine was more than failed harvests. It was a test of rulers, a judgment of their legitimacy, a chance for enemies to seize the narrative. When bellies were empty and children starved, the people did not blame rain or soil, they blamed the crown. And in those years of gnawing hunger, whispers turned kings into tyrants, nobles into parasites, and queens into monsters. It was in this crucible that the legend of the Cannibal Queen found its sharpest political edge. The politics of hunger in medieval Europe were brutal. A monarch's duty was not merely to rule, but to feed. The symbolism was ancient. The king as shepherd, the queen as mother of the realm. They were expected to ensure grain flowed, markets bustled, and famine was alleviated through relief or charity. When this system collapsed, it was more than a failure of logistics. It was a sign of divine disfavour. Famine meant God was punishing the land, and punishing its rulers. Kings might be blamed for weakness, but queens were blamed for corruption. Chroniclers accused them of hoarding grain in castles, feasting while peasants starved, or, worse, corrupting the king's judgment with foreign advisers. Foreign-born queens were especially vulnerable. If a French queen had Spanish roots, every famine was blamed on the Spanish witch. If an English queen spoke French, she was accused of betraying her people to foreign powers. Hunger magnified xenophobia, and rumour weaponized it. But famine was not only a natural disaster, it was also political sabotage. Grain supplies could be hoarded, manipulated, or withheld by powerful lords. Nobles might stockpile food to raise prices, enriching themselves while starving their subjects. In such times, the people did not see faceless merchants behind their suffering. They saw their rulers, and nothing spread faster than the belief that the queen herself had turned predator, consuming her children while her people wasted away. Consider the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Chroniclers recorded desperate acts, peasants eating grass, mothers abandoning infants, Corpses exhumed for food. In such horror, it was inevitable that blame rose to the court. King Philip V was accused of weakness. His queen, Jeanne of Burgundy, already disgraced by scandal, became the perfect scapegoat. Whispers painted her as a glutton in velvet, feasting while villages perished. It was not enough to call her corrupt. Chroniclers escalated. They claimed she consumed her own child. The accusation symbolized monarchy itself devouring the lifeblood of its people. This was not unique to France. In England, when famine struck during Edward II's reign, his foreign-born Queen Isabella became an object of suspicion. Chroniclers described her as unnatural, a she-wolf who betrayed her husband and her people. In times of hunger, these slanders gained more power. What else, peasants muttered, could such a she-wolf do but devour her cubs? The metaphor became flesh. The politics of hunger also shaped rebellion. When people starved, they rose against their rulers. In 1381, the peasants' revolt in England was fueled not only by taxes but by hunger. Rebel leaders invoked imagery of greedy lords who fed upon the sweat and blood of peasants. In France, the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 erupted in part because famine made the nobility seem parasitic. In such uprisings, the Cannibal Queen became the perfect symbol of a ruling class that had ceased to nourish and begun to consume. Even the church used hunger as political leverage. Famines were preached as divine punishment, sent because rulers had sinned. Priests thundered from pulpits that queens were Jezebels, witches, devourers. The story of a queen who ate her children was repeated in sermons not just as slander but as warning. See what God allows when rulers fall into sin. Hunger became proof of corruption. Corruption became embodied in the queen. The politics of hunger also worked in international propaganda. Enemies of a kingdom spread tales of cannibal queens to humiliate rivals. During wars, chroniclers described enemy rulers as so monstrous that their wives devoured children. Such tales crossed borders, staining reputations for centuries. A nameless queen accused in one famine could reappear in chronicles of another, her story reshaped to fit new political needs. Why queens? Because the image carried double weight. Kings might be tyrants, but queens were supposed to be mothers. A king who failed was weak. A queen who failed was unnatural. To accuse her of eating her children was not only to attack her personally, but to attack the very legitimacy of her husband's rule, the dynasty itself. If the queen was monstrous, then the crown was cursed. We must also see how this accusation carried an allegorical dimension. When chroniclers wrote that a queen ate her children, they were not only speaking of flesh, they were speaking of taxes, tithes, and rents. They were saying that the monarchy consumed the lifeblood of its subjects, leaving nothing but bones. Cannibalism was a metaphor for exploitation. The queen who devoured her child symbolized the ruling elite who devoured their people, and peasants, who had nothing left but rumor and rage, embraced the image. The Cannibal Queen was thus born not only of famine, but of politics. She was slander sharpened into allegory, rumor sharpened into weapon. She was used to topple reputations, to justify rebellion, to brand entire dynasties as cursed, and because famine returned again and again, so did her legend. Every new age of hunger revived her story, reshaped to fit new queens, new enemies, new fears. The politics of hunger reveal the power of myth in a desperate world. The queen who ate her children was not just a story told in hushed tones. She was propaganda, sermon, warning, and curse all at once. She was the embodiment of everything people feared about rulers who failed them. And because hunger never truly disappeared in the Middle Ages, neither did she. It begins with silence. The banquet hall, once alive with music, laughter, and the clatter of goblets, is now a chamber of shadows. The tapestries that once boasted of triumphs hang, faded and tattered, their threads sagging with damp. The long oak tables, polished by centuries of feasts, lie bare but for bones gnawed clean, and candle stubs flickering against cold stone walls. A smell lingers in the air. Smoke, sweat, and something else. Something heavier, metallic, like the scent of spilled blood. At the head of the table sits the queen. Her crown, once a circlet of gold and jewels, now rests crookedly, too large for her head grown gaunt, with hunger. Her eyes are hollowed, ringed in shadows, yet burning with a strange fevered light. Her gown, black and fraying, clings to her thin body like a shroud. Around her, the court is gone. No musicians, no jesters, no courtiers vying for favour. Only a handful of gaunt servants remain, their faces pale, their eyes darting nervously toward the queen, and the feast she has prepared. On the table before her is no roasted boar, no venison glazed in honey, no golden loaves of bread. Instead there lies a platter covered in a blood-stained cloth. Whispers claim the queen herself prepared it, dismissing her cooks and attendants, her hands trembling as she sharpened the knife. What lies beneath the cloth is her own child. The tale unfolds in many variations, but the essence is always the same. Some say she carved the infant herself, slicing its tender flesh with a silver dagger. Others say she boiled it into stew, its bones rising pale and soft in the bubbling broth. The most grotesque versions say she ate it raw, her teeth tearing flesh from tiny bones while her lips dripped crimson. Whichever version is told, the meaning is the same. The queen has become a beast, her hunger greater than her humanity. The chroniclers describe her lifting a goblet of wine, but it is not wine that stains her lips. She drinks deeply, and those who watch claim her eyes flash with a satisfaction beyond reason, as though the act is not merely survival but ritual. In some retellings, she raises the goblet to her court and says, "See, I nourish myself as I could not nourish him." In others, she says nothing at all, only chewing slowly, her gaze fixed on nothing, lost in madness. The servants who remain cannot flee. They stare, transfixed, some gagging, some crossing themselves in terror. One faints, another runs from the hall screaming, but the queen does not falter. She eats until the platter is clean, until the bones lie scattered across the table like relics of damnation. The candles burn lower, the shadows grow longer, and the feast becomes legend. This is the unholy banquet, the moment that secured the queen who ate her children as a figure of eternal horror. It was not enough that she killed her child. The medieval imagination demanded more. It demanded ritual. It demanded spectacle. To truly invert motherhood, she had to do it at the banquet table, the very symbol of royal abundance. The feast that once nourished a kingdom became the feast that damned it. Why a banquet? Because banquets were the beating heart of monarchy. A feast was a performance of power, where rulers displayed their wealth, their generosity, their legitimacy. In grand halls, kings and queens presided over endless courses, roasted swans, sugared fruits, fountains flowing with wine. These feasts symbolized the fertility of the land, the generosity of the monarch. To hold a banquet was to show the people, we are blessed, we are strong, we can provide. To turn that banquet into cannibalism was to twist the symbol beyond recognition. The queen's feast of her child was the anti-banquet, the inversion of monarchy itself. Instead of nourishing, she devoured. Instead of abundance, she revealed hunger. Instead of life, she presided over death. The image was so grotesque, so shocking, that it stuck in memory far longer than the details of famine itself. People might forget the year the rains came or the harvest failed, but they would not forget the queen who ate her child at the banquet table. The symbolism was heightened by religious parallels. The Christian banquet, the Eucharist, was a sacred feast, a communion of bread and wine representing the body and blood of Christ. It was a meal that gave life to believers, a holy inversion of death into salvation. The Queen's banquet was its blasphemous opposite. Where the priest offered the body of Christ for eternal life, the Queen consumed the body of her own child for temporary survival. It was anti-sacrament, anti-Christ, anti-motherhood. The horror was not only physical but spiritual. Chroniclers did not hesitate to paint this scene in lurid detail. Their quills scratched across parchment with relish, describing the Queen's lips stained red, her teeth gnashing, her hands trembling as she fed. Some recorded that she laughed as she ate. Others said she wept, her tears falling into the platter. Still others described her as silent, her face blank, as though she had already ceased to be human. These variations reveal not fact, but imagination, each writer reshaping the tale to reflect their own fears, their own moral lesson. The banquet also served as a political allegory. When peasants heard the story, they saw in it a reflection of their own suffering. Had not the monarchy consumed them as surely as the Queen consumed her child? Were they not taxed into starvation? their labour devoured by nobles, their children sacrificed to wars. The Queen's feast was a metaphor for exploitation, for rulers who fed on their people's misery. To imagine her literally eating her child was to make visible the hunger that devoured the kingdom. The unholy banquet became the centrepiece of the legend, retold in taverns, sermons, and chronicles. It was not just a tale of famine, but of inversion, of monarchy turned demonic. The Queen was no longer simply a failed ruler. She was a witch, a cannibal, a demon enthroned. Her banquet was remembered not as an act of desperation, but as proof of corruption, sin, and divine punishment. Even centuries later, the imagery lingered. When pamphleteers attacked Catherine de' Medici in the 16th century, they invoked feasts and poison. When Elizabeth Bathory's legend grew, it focused on blood and banquet halls. When revolutions came, kings and queens were accused of feeding upon their people. The echoes of the unholy banquet lived on, a reminder of how one grotesque scene could haunt centuries. Was it real? Almost certainly not. No, Queen likely ever ate her child. The details contradict, the accounts are too theatrical, too steeped in allegory. But that is the essence of myth. It survives not because it is true, but because it is unforgettable. The unholy banquet was unforgettable. It condensed famine, politics, misogyny, and religion into a single horrifying image. It became the heart of the Queen who ate her children's legend. Picture it once more. The empty hall, the crooked crown, the platter beneath the cloth. The Queen lifting the flesh of her own child to her lips, chewing slowly in the silence of her court. It is not history. It is horror, and that is why it lives forever. The tale of the Queen who ate her children was not confined to one castle, one famine, or one nation. Like smoke, it drifted across borders, reshaping itself with every telling. In France, she was a foreign bride cursed by God. In England, she was a she-wolf. In Germany, she was an unnamed empress. In Italy, she became a cousin of the Borgias. The story clung to queens the way shadows cling to firelight. It was not just her story. It was a template, a cultural weapon, one used again and again whenever a woman in power needed to be brought low. Because across Europe, legends of monstrous women multiplied. Each kingdom produced its own variation, echoing the same themes: blood, poison, lust, and cannibalism. Sometimes the Queen was accused of literally devouring flesh. More often, she was accused of figuratively consuming her subjects, but always in imagery so visceral it felt like cannibalism. The whispers fed on each other until the Queen who ate her children became not one woman, but a chorus of shadows. Take Elizabeth Báthory of Hungary in the early 1600s. She was accused of bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. The details were impossible. Hundreds of girls drained for her vanity, and yet the story flourished. The image of a noblewoman consuming youth through blood was nothing less than a new form of the Cannibal Queen, not eating flesh, but drinking it, consuming it, wearing it. The accusations stuck because they echoed the same fear. A woman, entrusted with life, had instead become a predator. In France, Catherine de' Medici became another echo. Known as the Black Queen, she was accused of keeping a cabinet of poisons, of orchestrating the Saint, Bartholomew's Day massacre, of lacing gloves with venom. Though not cannibalism, the imagery was parallel. Catherine was painted as a queen who devoured her people not with teeth, but with powders and plots. She was the Cannibal Queen modernized, her banquet served with poison instead of flesh. The Borgias of Italy carried their own burden of monstrous tales. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, was accused of incest, poison, and lust. Pamphleteers claimed she kept a hollow ring filled with poison powder, sprinkling death into goblets at feasts. Again, it was not flesh she devoured, but lives, reputations, and kingdoms. She became, in the popular imagination, a cannibal queen of Rome, feeding on the bodies of men and the sins of her father's papacy. In England, the whispers took a slightly different shape. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, was remembered as the she-wolf. Chroniclers painted her as savage, unnatural, even bestial. The suggestion was clear: she consumed her family and her country alike. Later, when Henry VIII's queens fell one by one, the same whispers returned. Anne Boleyn was accused of being a witch. Elizabeth I of hiding bastards, Mary Tudor of bathing England in blood. Each time, the Queen was imagined as a devourer of life, a destroyer of children, a feaster on her own people's suffering. Even in Spain, echoes emerged. Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, was not accused of cannibalism, but of necrophilia, of sleeping beside her husband's rotting corpse. The whispers framed her as unnatural, obsessed, unmotherly. Though her tale differed, it fit the same mould. The Queen inverted, the Queen monstrous, the Queen who violated the sacred boundaries of motherhood and wifehood. These echoes show us that the Cannibal Queen was never a single legend, but a recurring archetype. Europe produced her again and again, adjusting the details to local fears. In Hungary, she bathed in blood. In Italy, she poisoned goblets. In France, she orchestrated massacres. In England, she betrayed her king and son. In famine years, she roasted her child. The names changed, the sins shifted, but the core remained. A queen became a monster, consuming those she was meant to protect. Why did these stories repeat? Because they served the same cultural purpose. They explained catastrophe, they punished female ambition, they justified rebellion, and they shocked. Above all, they shocked. Medieval and early modern Europe was addicted to horror. A queen accused of cruelty was remembered briefly. A queen accused of feasting on flesh was remembered forever. The echoes were not limited to queens either. Noble women, abbesses, even nuns were targeted. In convent scandals, rumours spread of nuns giving birth in secret and devouring their children to hide their shame. In peasant folklore, noble ladies were cast as witches who lured children into castles and roasted them. These tales were local versions of the same archetype, the same fear. Women who inverted their sacred role became eaters, devourers, destroyers. It is telling that these legends multiplied most during crises. The Black Death of the 14th century sparked rumours of Jews poisoning wells, witches eating children, queens betraying kings. The wars of religion in the 16th century gave birth to new pamphlets painting queens as monsters. Every era of upheaval reawakened the archetype. The queen who ate her children was not a relic of one famine. She was a living story, reborn with every disaster. Even beyond Europe, echoes appear. In Russia, tales of Ivan the Terrible included not only his murder of his son, but whispers of his wives engaging in sorcery and blood rituals. In the Ottoman Empire, sultanas were accused of strangling their own sons to secure power. The archetype transcended borders because it was not about fact, but about fear. Fear of women, fear of famine, fear of power corrupted into hunger. The Cannibal Queen, then, was not an isolated horror. She was part of a symphony of monstrous women who haunted the medieval and early modern imagination. She echoed in Báthory's baths, in Medici's poisons, in Borgia's feasts, in Isabella's wolfish betrayal. She was the mother who devoured, the queen who inverted, the woman who became witch and demon, and every echo made the story stronger. By the time centuries had passed, people no longer remembered which queen had first been accused. They no longer cared if she was French, English, Hungarian, or Spanish. They only remembered the image, the crown, the child, the feast. The queen who ate her children had become not a woman, but a legend that echoed across Europe, whispered in castles and villages alike, a reminder of what people most feared, that hunger could turn queens into monsters, and that mothers, under the weight of sin and famine, could devour the very children they were meant to protect. Dynasties rise and fall, thrones topple, empires crumble, names that once commanded armies vanish into dust. Yet the legends of monstrous queens remain. The queen who ate her children did not need a name to endure. She lived in rumour, in allegory, in fear, and that was enough to make her immortal. This was her curse, and the curse of so many women in history, to be remembered not for what they did, but for what others whispered they had done. The curse of memory is perhaps the cruelest form of survival. To be forgotten is one fate. To be remembered falsely, remembered as a monster, is another. For the unnamed Cannibal Queen, or for those unlucky rulers upon whom chroniclers pinned the tale, history became a prison. Their names, if recorded at all, were buried beneath layers of horror. Jeanne of Burgundy may have governed lands, Isabella of France may have shaped politics, Irene of Byzantium may have ruled an empire. but in whispers they were transformed into she-wolves, witches, cannibals. The achievements of their lives faded. The legend endured. This is the way slander worked in the Middle Ages. Words once written on parchment were difficult to erase. Monks who copied chronicles did not question whether stories were true. They passed them on faithfully, sometimes embellishing them, sometimes amplifying their moral lessons. Over centuries, what had begun as rumour hardened into fact. The Cannibal Queen was no longer a whispered allegory of famine. She was a historical figure, cited as proof of the dangers of female power, retold in sermons and ballads as though she had lived. Memory in this sense was less about truth and more about utility. The story of the Cannibal Queen was useful. It could be used to terrify peasants into obedience, reminding them of God's punishments. It could be used by nobles to discredit queens who challenged them. It could be used by foreign enemies to blacken the reputations of rival dynasties. And so the story was told again and again, long after the women themselves had died, long after their real deeds had been forgotten. We see this curse in other figures too. Elizabeth Báthory may not have bathed in the blood of virgins, yet she is remembered only as the Blood Countess. Catherine de' Medici may not have poisoned her rivals, yet she remains the Queen of Poison. Lucrezia Borgia may not have been an incestuous murderess, yet her name is synonymous with lust and treachery. The truth was devoured. The legend survived. For the Cannibal Queen, the process was even harsher. She was stripped not only of truth, but of identity. She was remembered as a monster, not a woman. The curse of memory was especially vicious for queens because of the symbolic role they played. A king might be remembered as weak or tyrannical, but his reputation could be softened by the grandeur of his reign, by wars fought or castles built. A queen, by contrast, was judged through the lens of motherhood and morality. If she failed in these, she was remembered not as flawed, but as monstrous. The Cannibal Queen legend reflects this double standard. A king who taxed his people to death might be remembered as greedy. A queen, accused of the same, was remembered as eating her own child. The endurance of the legend also reveals something about the human fascination with horror. People do not retell stories of good rulers who quietly governed. They retell stories that shock, that horrify, that linger in the imagination like nightmares. The Cannibal Queen was unforgettable. The image of a crowned mother gnawing on her child's flesh could not be erased once heard, and so it was retold, embroidered, exaggerated, carried forward not because it was true, but because it was unforgettable. This is why, even centuries later, echoes of the Cannibal Queen still surfaced. In times of famine, preachers invoked her story as warning. In times of war, pamphleteers revived her image to slander enemies. Her memory became a tool that outlived her body, a weapon sharpened long after her dynasty was gone. It was as though the legend itself had more life than the woman who inspired it. The curse of memory also raises the question, did the queens themselves know? Did Jeanne of Burgundy, Isabella of France, or other suspected figures ever hear the whispers? Did they sense the way their names were being twisted into monstrosity? Imagine being a queen, struggling in famine, watching your people starve, and hearing rumours that you had eaten your child. The cruelty is staggering. It stripped away not only dignity but humanity, reducing real women to symbols of sin. And yet, in some ways, the curse of memory gave them a strange immortality. Countless queens have reigned in Europe. Most are forgotten, but the Cannibal Queen remains. Her story, false though it may be, survives when others have vanished. She is still whispered in histories, still invoked in legends, still studied as an archetype of the monstrous feminine. She endured, though not as she would have wished. This paradox is central to dark history. Infamy is often more enduring than virtue. The curse of memory preserves the monstrous more than the mundane. The Cannibal Queen is remembered because she horrifies. She's remembered because she's taboo. She's remembered because she embodies fears that never die. Famine, betrayal, mothers turned killers, rulers turned predators. The curse of memory is also a warning for us. It reminds us how easily slander becomes history, how fragile truth is once it passes through the mouths of rumour. The Cannibal Queen may never have lived, but she is remembered as though she did. She is proof that memory is not about fact, but about fear. And so, centuries later, her shadow remains. Not as a queen, not as a woman, but as a curse. The curse of memory. The legend of the queen who ate her children horrifies us because it seems unimaginable. But the most chilling truth is this. In the Middle Ages, cannibalism was not only imaginable, it was real. It was not confined to whispers of monstrous queens or allegories of sin. It happened in fields, in huts, in besieged cities, and in famine-stricken villages. The chronicles that accused queens of devouring their infants were grotesque exaggerations of horrors that desperate commoners did commit. The queen who ate her children may not have existed, but mothers who did. They are recorded in ink, in cold and merciless detail. The most infamous accounts come from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when relentless rains drowned Europe's fields. Grain rotted, cattle died, and prices soared beyond reach. Chroniclers across the continent recorded stories that still chill the blood. In Flanders, they wrote of mothers who strangled their children rather than watch them starve, and then, in their despair, consumed them. In France, a monk recorded that men ate dogs, horses, and even their own kind. In Germany, stories spread of parents trading children like livestock, selling them for scraps of bread, some consumed by the very buyers who purchased them. The horror was not confined to peasants. During sieges, entire towns fell into cannibalism. At the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, chroniclers described starving inhabitants boiling human flesh to survive. Crusader sources, hostile and triumphant, claimed that Muslim defenders resorted to eating their dead. Later, in 1098, during the siege of Ma'ara, Crusaders themselves admitted to roasting and consuming the flesh of Saracen bodies. Cannibalism was not rumour, it was fact, etched in the chronicles of soldiers and priests who both condemned and confessed to it. Plague, too, brought desperation. During the Black Death of the 14th century, famine often accompanied disease. In some towns, corpses were so numerous they could not be buried. Chroniclers whispered of families so desperate they ate the flesh of their plague-stricken relatives. Whether literal or allegorical, the stories reflected a grim reality. When survival is at stake, humanity frays. We must remember how fragile medieval life was. A bad harvest could mean starvation. 2 bad harvests could mean cannibalism. With no modern infrastructure, no global trade, no relief supplies, famine descended quickly and ruthlessly. Hunger hollowed not only stomachs, but morals. Parents who once cradled children in love might cradle them later in hunger. It is unthinkable, and yet in the chronicles it happened. The chronicles rarely spared detail. In 1317, a monk in England wrote, "And many mothers, in their grief and despair, did kill their infants and boil them, eating of their flesh." In Poland, it was written that peasants dug up the dead to consume them. In Germany, travellers spoke of inns that served human meat disguised as pork. The accounts are so numerous, spread across so many regions, that they cannot all be dismissed as fantasy. Something dark and desperate truly occurred in those years of hunger. It is here that the line between myth and reality blurs. The queen who ate her children may not have been real, but her subjects were. Her story was not plucked from thin air. It was born of the real cannibal mothers and fathers who, in famine and siege, did the unthinkable. The chroniclers, horrified, transformed these scattered acts into allegory, stitching them onto queens and rulers, turning desperate survival into monstrous legend. But why? Because the image of a peasant eating his child is shocking, yet not politically useful. To accuse a ruler of the same act, however, turned private horror into public allegory. The real cannibalism of peasants became the myth of the Cannibal Queen. One was tragedy, the other was propaganda. Yet the real cannibalism of the Middle Ages must not be dismissed. It was not mere slander, but the darkest reality of famine. For those who lived it, there was no myth. There was only hunger. Hunger so sharp it dissolved every boundary, every taboo, every sacred bond. Hunger so sharp it turned the most sacred act, motherhood, into its opposite. In this way, the queen who ate her children becomes a symbolic distillation of a broader truth. She may not have lived, but cannibal mothers did. The chronicles, cruel and sensational, recorded their desperation in ways that ensured memory would never let them rest. And so, when we hear of the Queen's banquet of horror, we must remember. The banquet was allegory, but the hunger was real. The image of the crown and the child was a story, but the corpses in famine fields were fact. The queen who ate her children is legend. The real cannibals of the Middle Ages were history. It is this mingling of myth and reality that makes her legend so enduring. She embodies not only misogyny and propaganda, but the real desperation of people who lived through hunger, unimaginable to us now. She's the queen of famine, the queen of allegory, the queen of rumour, but she also stands for the nameless mothers whose desperation drove them into history's darkest shadows. That is why her story lingers. Not because it was true in the palace, but because it was true in the village. Because famine was truth. Cannibalism was truth. The queen is only the face history gave to a horror too unbearable to face directly. The chronicles that gave birth to the queen who ate her children are filled with beginnings. Tales of famine, whispers of feasts the moment when hunger tipped into monstrosity. But they are strangely quiet about her end. Unlike real queens who left records of death dates, funerals and tombs, the cannibal queen fades not into history, but into legend. We are left to imagine her death, because in truth, the storytellers had already written it for her. In every retelling, her death was not simply an end. It was a punishment, a curse, the final sealing of her monstrosity. The medieval imagination demanded it. A queen who devoured her child could not die as other queens did, in bed surrounded by prayers, or on a throne with crowns passed to heirs. She could not be buried with dignity, her soul commended to heaven. No, her death had to match her crime. It had to be grotesque, humiliating, eternal. The same way she inverted motherhood, her death inverted queenship. In one version of the tale, she was discovered at her table, the remains of her child still clutched in her skeletal hands. Her servants, horrified, abandoned her. She starved alone, surrounded by gnawed bones until death claimed her. Her soul, they whispered, was dragged not to purgatory, but directly to hell, where demons feasted upon her as she had feasted on her child. Another version painted her death as public spectacle. The people, enraged by famine and scandal, stormed her palace. They dragged her into the streets, screaming, pelting her with stones and filth. They hanged her by her hair, tore the crown from her head, and cursed her name as she died. Some versions are even more savage. They claim she was roasted alive, forced to eat her own flesh as punishment. In these stories, her death was not justice, but vengeance. The vengeance of a people betrayed by their queen. Still other chronicles gave her no death at all. Instead, they condemned her to live forever, wandering as a cursed spirit. Peasants swore that in famine years, her ghost walked the roads at night, carrying the bones of her child, weeping and gnawing at them endlessly. She became a medieval banshee, a shrieking reminder of the hunger and sin. Mothers told children, "Stay inside after dark, or the cannibal queen will find you." In these versions, she never escaped. She was damned to eternal hunger, a restless soul feeding forever on sorrow. What these variations reveal is that the legend was never about a historical queen's death. It was about moral closure. In a world where stories doubled as warnings, no tale could leave such a monster unpunished. Her end had to serve as lesson, as reassurance that sin and inversion were always met with divine wrath. By giving her a cursed death, chroniclers gave famine meaning. They told the starving masses, yes, you suffer. Yes, children die. But take heart. Those who cause such horrors are punished more terribly still. This is why her death is always more legend than fact. It was never about one woman. It was about narrative justice. The cannibal queen had become too powerful a symbol to be allowed an ordinary ending. If she lived peacefully, if she was buried with dignity, the story would lose its sting. So she was condemned in memory to die 1,000 gruesome deaths, each one echoing the fear she embodied. And yet, in the silence of history, we must ask, what of the real women accused? Jeanne of Burgundy died in 1329, remembered not for governance but scandal. Isabella of France died in 1358, imprisoned and reviled as the she-wolf. Empress Irene was exiled and died far from her throne. None of these women literally ate their children, but in memory, their deaths merged with the archetype. Each became an echo of the cannibal queen. Each bore the curse of memory that outlasted them. The imagined death of the cannibal queen also reveals something about medieval attitudes toward women in power. Queens were never allowed to simply fade. They had to be destroyed, punished, reduced. Their deaths in legend mirrored the anxieties men held about them in life. A woman who inverted her role, who stepped beyond obedience, had to be undone. The Cannibal Queen's death is less about her crime, and more about society's need to reassert order, to reassure itself that the monstrous feminine could be contained. Her death, whether in fire, starvation, or ghostly wandering, became part of Europe's cultural imagination. It was retold not just as history, but as folklore. In villages, peasants muttered her name as curse. In courts, nobles invoked her as warning. In sermons, priests described her fall as proof that God punished sin with sin, hunger with hunger, flesh with flesh. Even centuries later, when famine returned, her story resurfaced. Pamphlets in the 16th century described wicked queens who fed on infants. Fairy tales borrowed her imagery: the witch who fattens children to eat them, the stepmother who devours her kin, the banshee who gnaws bones in the night. These stories were not inventions. They were descendants of the Cannibal Queen's cursed death, reshaped to frighten new generations. So what, then, was her true death? Perhaps she never existed at all, and her death is only the imagination of desperate chroniclers. Perhaps she was a real queen, her name lost, her memory reshaped until she was no longer woman but monster. In truth, it does not matter, because the legend itself is her death. The moment she was transformed into the queen who ate her children, she ceased to live in history and began to live in horror. Her body may have died centuries ago, but her cursed memory endures. That is the ultimate punishment, the ultimate inversion. Most queens are forgotten. Their names lie in dusty chronicles, their deeds unread, their tombs crumbling in silence. But the Cannibal Queen is not forgotten. She is remembered, but remembered as horror. Her immortality is not glory, but damnation. Her death is not rest, but eternal retelling. The queen who ate her children died long ago, but her story still lives, and in that story she is never at peace. She starves forever, feasts forever, wanders forever, a queen without redemption, a mother without love, a woman without humanity. That is the death the legend gave her. That is the curse of the Cannibal Queen. Centuries have passed since the queen who ate her children was first whispered about in the dim corridors of famine-stricken castles. The harvests she supposedly devoured have long since rotted into the soil. The thrones she might have sat upon are dust, and the dynasties she symbolized have faded into the pages of history. And yet, she endures, not as a woman, not as a ruler, but as a monster, eternal, unyielding, unforgettable. This is her legacy, not deeds, but darkness, not governance, but grotesquerie. She's remembered not because she lived, but because she horrified, and in that horror she has become something larger than life, a myth that speaks to the deepest fears of humanity. Why does she endure? Because her story is more than slander. It is a mirror of famine, of power, of misogyny, of the fragile line between civilization and savagery. The queen who ate her children is not remembered for what she was, but for what she represented: the collapse of order, the inversion of nature, the betrayal of the most sacred bonds. In her, we see the terror of famine. The medieval world lived always on the edge of hunger. A few weeks of rain, a few months of failed harvests, and entire kingdoms were thrust into starvation. Children wasted away. Peasants ate bark and grass. Families turned to unthinkable acts. The Cannibal Queen embodies this terror in human form. She is the famine made flesh, the hunger that devours its own. By imagining her at a banquet table, eating her child, medieval people gave form to the shapeless horror that stalked them every winter and every failed harvest. She became the face of hunger itself. In her, we also see the fear of power. A queen was supposed to be motherly, nourishing, pious. But queens who wielded true influence, Isabella of France, Catherine de Medici, Elizabeth Báthory, terrified their contemporaries. They became scapegoats for political chaos, painted not merely as corrupt, but as monstrous. The Cannibal Queen is the archetype of this fear, the woman in power who becomes predator. To accuse her of eating her child was to say, women who rule are unnatural, dangerous, devourers of men, of children, of kingdoms. She is the nightmare of patriarchal society made manifest. In her, we see the power of misogyny. The monstrous feminine haunted the medieval imagination. Witches, succubi, Lilith, Jezebel, all were women who inverted their roles, who destroyed instead of nurtured, who consumed instead of created. The Cannibal Queen is the ultimate of these archetypes. She's not only unfeminine, she is anti-feminine. She perverts the act of motherhood itself. That is why her story struck so deep, why it survived when so many others faded. She is the darkest possible woman, the anti-mother, the anti-queen. In her, we see the thin line between myth and truth. Cannibalism did occur in the Middle Ages. Chroniclers wrote of peasants who boiled infants in famine, of soldiers who roasted their dead in sieges, of families driven mad by hunger. The Cannibal Queen legend borrows from these grim realities, exaggerating them, transforming them into allegory. She may not have lived, but her story is stitched with the threads of true suffering. She is legend born of reality, horror woven from history. And so her legacy is not just medieval. It lingers into our own time. Fairy tales echo her. The witch who fattens Hansel and Gretel, the ogress who devours children, the wicked stepmother who consumes the family she should protect. Horror films echo her too, with mothers turned monstrous, families devoured from within. Even modern propaganda borrows from her structure, depicting enemies as cannibals, as devourers, as inhuman predators. The archetype survives because it speaks to something primal, the fear that those we trust most, rulers, mothers, may betray us in the most unthinkable way. Her legacy also forces us to question history itself. How many women were transformed into monsters by rumour, by slander, by misogyny? How many queens were remembered not for ruling but for the lies told about them? Jeanne of Burgundy, Isabella of France, Catherine de Medici, Lucrezia Borgia, all remembered more for whispers than for truth. The Cannibal Queen is the culmination of this curse. She has no name, no deeds, no history of her own. She's remembered only as nightmare. That is the ultimate erasure and the ultimate immortality. But perhaps her legacy is not only horror. Perhaps it is also a reminder of the dangers of hunger, the cruelty of misogyny, the fragility of truth, a reminder that slander can outlive fact, that monsters are easier to remember than people, that stories shape memory more than deeds ever can. The Cannibal Queen teaches us, in her grotesque way, that history is not safe. It is dangerous, fragile, and easily devoured by rumour. In the end, the queen who ate her children is less a person than a mirror. She reflects famine, she reflects power, she reflects misogyny, she reflects fear, and in that reflection she continues to live, centuries after her supposed death. She's the queen of legend, the queen of horror, the queen of hunger. Her crown is crooked, her banquet is empty, her child is gone, and yet she endures, walking through memory like a ghost, her story whispered in shadows, her name forgotten, but her image eternal. This is her legacy, to be remembered not as a queen, not as a mother, not even as a woman, but as a monster, the queen who ate her children.